I was barely 16 when Margaret decided I had no place in the life she was building. It happened in February, during one of those brutal winter storms where the snow falls so thick you can barely see 3 feet ahead. That's when she and David packed everything I owned into black trash bags. Not moving boxes, not suitcases, trash bags. Like I was garbage being thrown out. David stood guard at the doorway the entire time, arms folded across his chest, making sure I understood this wasn't up for discussion. Margaret tore down every certificate I'd earned from school, every award that hung on the refrigerator, and ripped them right down the middle. Her words still echo in my head. "You were always Robert's child, never mine. You're destroying everything David and I are trying to build." David added his own thoughts. Something about finally having a real family, now that the burden from her first marriage was leaving. Margaret crumpled up 3 $20 bills and threw them at my feet, saying that was the last cent I'd ever see from her. But the moment that really burned itself into my memory was watching her drag those trash bags to the curb and threaten me. She said if I ever came back, she'd report me to the police for stalking. David shouted from inside that they'd have me arrested for harassment. Then Margaret went back inside, and I heard the deadbolt slide into place. I stood there in that freezing snow for almost half an hour before I finally called Robert. My father showed up in his old pickup truck. He didn't ask questions, didn't make speeches. He just helped me load those trash bags into the back and drove me across town to his apartment. Robert worked long days in construction and lived in a modest 2-bedroom place that always smelled like fresh coffee and wood shavings. That same night, he cleared out his spare room and told me I could stay as long as I needed. We never really discussed what Margaret had done. Robert just made it clear that I had a home with him. No strings attached. Here's the part Margaret either forgot about or thought I'd never act on. When I was born, Robert's parents, my grandparents, had established a trust fund for me, and that trust included the house Margaret had just kicked me out of. The property was legally held in trust, with Margaret granted the right to live there until I turned 23. At 23, complete ownership would transfer to me. Margaret either genuinely forgot about this arrangement, or she assumed I'd never have the courage to claim what was rightfully mine. She was wrong about that. Robert never pushed me to reconnect with Margaret. He simply let me exist, helped me graduate high school, and supported my decision to attend community college. He taught me practical skills, basic construction, home repairs, financial management. Robert wasn't perfect, but he was present. That's something Margaret never managed to be. Now I'm 23 years old. I completed my associate degree, landed a solid job in office administration, and spent the last 7 years quietly preparing for this moment. 2 weeks ago, I turned 23. The trust dissolved automatically, and the property deed transferred into my name. I spent those 7 years making absolutely certain every document was legally sound, every requirement satisfied. I worked with the same attorney who'd originally set up the trust, and together we confirmed that Margaret had zero legal claim to the house anymore. None whatsoever. She'd been living there without paying rent for 7 years, believing it was hers, believing she'd won. Last Thursday, I had a courier deliver an envelope to her workplace. Inside was a formal notice giving her 60 days to vacate the property. The notice included copies of the trust documents, the deed transfer, and a letter from my attorney explaining that I was exercising my rights as the property owner. I also included a personal note. It was brief. I told her the house had always belonged to me, that she'd been living in my property since the day she threw me out, and that her time there had come to an end. By Friday morning, my phone was blowing up. 89 missed calls from a number I didn't recognize at first. Then I listened to the voicemails. It was Margaret. Her voice shook in every message, becoming more desperate with each one. She kept repeating my name, begging me to call her back, insisting there must be some mistake. By the 10th voicemail, she was crying. By the 20th, she was screaming that I couldn't do this, that she had rights, that I was being cruel. David left messages too. At first he tried to sound reasonable, suggesting we sit down like adults and work something out. But by his 5th message, he was furious, calling me vindictive and immature, saying I didn't understand the financial damage I was causing them. I haven't responded to a single call or text. I've been waiting 7 years for this moment, and I'm not rushing it. They wanted me gone. Wanted to pretend I never existed. Wanted to build their perfect life without me in it. Fine. But they built that life in my house, on my property, and now they're confronting the reality that their fresh start was never actually theirs. This morning, Margaret sent a text from David's phone since I never responded to hers. She said they need to meet again because there are serious problems with the house I don't know about, issues that are going to cost me a fortune if I take ownership. She claimed she's trying to protect me from making an expensive mistake. I have no idea what she's talking about, but I'm about to find out. First update. Thanks to everyone who commented on my last post. I know some of you think I should just let them stay or work out some kind of payment arrangement. I'm not doing that, but I appreciate hearing different perspectives. Monday happened exactly as they said it would. Margaret and David showed up at Robert's apartment around 3 in the afternoon. Robert was at work, so it was just me. I'd been waiting in the living room with my laptop open and all my legal documents printed and organized on the coffee table. When the doorbell rang, I let them wait about 30 seconds before opening the door. Margaret looked older than I remembered. She was wearing business clothes, probably came straight from work, and her eyes were bloodshot. David stood right behind her in a button-down shirt and dress pants, trying to project authority or professionalism or something. They walked in without asking permission, and Margaret immediately started talking about how we needed to fix this misunderstanding, how there had to be a solution that worked for everyone. I sat down on the couch and gestured to the chairs across from me. They sat. David kept glancing at the documents on the table, probably trying to read them upside down. Margaret launched into this whole speech about how she never knew about the trust arrangement. How if she'd understood the house would transfer to me, she would have handled things differently 7 years ago. She kept insisting she thought the house was part of the divorce settlement with Robert, that she'd assumed it became hers when they split. I let her talk for about 5 minutes before cutting in. I told her she absolutely knew about the trust because my grandparents had explained it to both her and Robert when they established it. I was 3 years old at the time, but the documents were crystal clear, and her signature was on the original paperwork acknowledging the terms. She started to argue, saying she didn't remember signing anything like that. It was 20 years ago. How could anyone remember every document they'd ever signed? David tried a different approach. He said even if the house was technically mine now, they'd been living there for 7 years, maintaining it, paying all the utilities and property taxes. He claimed they'd put at least $40,000 into renovations and updates, new roof, new appliances, bathroom remodel. He said legally they deserved compensation for improving my property, and any judge would see it that way. I'd been expecting this argument. I pulled out my copies of the trust documents and pointed to the specific clause stating that any improvements made to the property during the trust period were made at the temporary resident's own expense and risk, with no expectation of reimbursement. My grandparents had been thorough. Margaret's face went pale when she saw that clause. David started arguing that it couldn't be enforceable, that it was unreasonable, that no court would uphold something that one-sided. That's when Margaret switched tactics completely. She started talking about how difficult the last 7 years had been for her, how she'd made mistakes, but she was still my mother, how families should support each other through hard times. She brought up memories from when I was little, before the divorce, trying to remind me of good times we'd had together. She said she'd been under tremendous stress when she met David, that she was trying to build a stable life, and she'd made some poor choices, but she never stopped caring about me. I asked her why she changed her phone number the same day she kicked me out. Why she threatened to get a restraining order if I tried to contact her. Why she moved without telling me where. She got defensive, said I was taking things out of context, that she'd been afraid of the situation becoming volatile, that Robert had been influencing me against her. David jumped in, saying they'd needed space to establish their marriage, that having me around had been creating too much tension, and there it was, the real reason. David admitted that I'd been a problem for them, that my presence had been interfering with their relationship, and they'd needed me gone to make things work. He tried to frame it as a mature decision, like they'd been doing what was best for everyone. Margaret didn't contradict him. She just sat there nodding, saying it had been complicated, that I was old enough now to understand that adult relationships require compromise and sometimes difficult choices. I told them they made their choice 7 years ago, and now I was making mine. The 60-day notice stood. They needed to be out by mid-March. Margaret started crying again, saying they couldn't just uproot their entire lives in 60 days, that it was unreasonable and cruel. David said they'd already started looking at rentals, but everything in their price range was in worse neighborhoods, smaller spaces, and they'd been counting on staying in the house for at least another few years, while they saved for a down payment on their own place. That's when I learned they'd been using the house as a permanent solution. They had no savings. Everything they earned went to their lifestyle, their cars, their vacations. They'd been living beyond their means because they thought they had free housing forever. Margaret admitted they'd told everyone the house was theirs, that David's parents thought they owned it, that their friends believed they were homeowners. Moving now would be humiliating on top of financially devastating. David tried to negotiate. He offered to pay me rent for the next year, said they could work out a lease agreement, that they'd even signed something giving me the option to evict them with 30 days' notice if anything went wrong. He threw out numbers, started at $800 a month, went up to $1,500 when I didn't respond. Margaret added that they could help maintain the property, that I wouldn't have to worry about anything. They'd take care of everything like they'd been doing. I told them no. The house was mine, and I had my own plans for it. I wasn't interested in being their landlord. Wasn't interested in any arrangement that kept them in my property. David's face turned red. He said I was being vindictive, that this was just revenge for being kicked out 7 years ago, that I was acting like a child who couldn't let go of the past. He said real adults move on from childhood hurts and don't use legal technicalities to destroy other people's lives. Margaret grabbed his arm, trying to get him to calm down, but he kept going. He said I was proving exactly why they'd needed me gone, that I was petty and vindictive and incapable of understanding what it took to build a real adult relationship. He said Robert had clearly raised me to be just like him, bitter and unable to move forward. I stood up and told them they had 60 days. That was what the law required, and that was what they were getting. Not 61 days, not a lease agreement, not a compromise. They could spend those 60 days figuring out their next move, or they could spend it trying to guilt trip me. But either way, they'd be out by the deadline. Margaret was sobbing now, asking me how I could do this to her, how I could be so heartless to my own mother. David was pacing, saying they'd talk to a lawyer, that they'd fight this if they had to, that I'd be hearing from their attorney. I walked to the door and opened it. Told them our conversation was over. David stormed out. Margaret followed him, turning back to look at me one more time before she left. She said I'd regret this, that destroying their life wouldn't make me feel better, that I was making a mistake I couldn't take back. They left. I closed the door. Robert came home an hour later. I told him what happened, and he asked if I was okay. I said yes. He nodded and started making dinner. We didn't talk about it after that. This morning I got a text from a number I didn't recognize. It was Margaret using David's phone since I never responded to hers. She said they need to meet again because there are things about the house I don't know. Problems with the property that are going to cost me a lot of money if I take ownership. She said she's trying to protect me from making an expensive mistake. And I should at least hear her out before I do something I'll regret. I don't know what she's talking about, but I'm going to find out. Second update. All right. So about that cryptic text from Margaret about property problems, I met with them again Wednesday evening. I told them we could meet at a coffee shop near Robert's place. Neutral territory. I wasn't letting them back into the apartment. They showed up together again, both looking worse than Monday. David had dark circles under his eyes, and Margaret's makeup couldn't hide that she'd been crying constantly. We sat down at a corner table and Margaret started right in with her warning about the house. She said there were foundation issues, water damage in the basement, and the electrical system needed a complete overhaul. She estimated at least $30,000 in repairs that would need to happen soon, maybe more. She said they'd been managing it on a limited budget, but that I'd be inheriting a money pit if I forced them out. Asked why they'd put $40,000 into cosmetic renovations, but ignored $30,000 in critical repairs. David got defensive and said the renovations were necessary to maintain property value, and they'd been planning to address the other issues gradually. Margaret added that they'd gotten quotes from contractors and could show me the estimates if I wanted proof. Here's the thing, though. I'd already had the house inspected. 2 weeks ago, right after the trust dissolved, I hired an inspector to go through everything. The foundation was fine. No water damage. Electrical system was up to code. And the roof they'd supposedly replaced 3 years ago? It was the original roof from 1998, just cleaned and patched. I pulled out my inspection report right there at the table and slid it across to them. Margaret's face went pale. David grabbed the report and started flipping through it, then tried to argue that my inspector must have missed things, that he clearly didn't check thoroughly enough. I told them the inspector had proper credentials, had been thorough, and his report directly contradicted every claim they'd just made. That's when Margaret broke down and admitted they'd lied about the repairs to try to scare me into backing off. But then she said something that caught my attention. She mentioned they'd been counting on the house for their retirement plan, that they'd already made commitments based on owning it. I asked what kind of commitments. David told her to stop talking, but she was already too far gone. She told me they'd been telling David's parents for years that they owned the house, and 6 months ago, David's parents had given them $50,000 as an early inheritance based on that assumption. David's parents thought they were investing in their son's property. They'd given them the money with the understanding that Margaret and David owned a house worth about $300,000, that they were financially stable homeowners. The $50,000 was supposed to help them pay off some debts and start a real investment portfolio. Except Margaret and David had spent most of it. New cars, vacation to Hawaii, paying off credit cards they'd maxed out again within months. I asked if David's parents knew the truth now. David said no, and they couldn't find out because his parents would demand the money back immediately, money they no longer had. He said his father had made it clear the $50,000 was contingent on them being stable, responsible homeowners, not people who'd been living rent-free in someone else's property for 7 years. Margaret started begging me to reconsider the eviction. She said if David's parents found out the truth, it would destroy their relationship with them, potentially cost them another inheritance down the line, and leave them completely isolated from David's family. She offered to pay me rent again, went up to $2,000 a month this time, said they'd sign a long-term lease. Anything to avoid having to tell David's parents they'd been lying. I told them that wasn't my problem. They'd lied to David's parents. They'd spent money that wasn't really theirs to spend, and now they were facing consequences. David stood up and said I was being vindictive, that I clearly wanted to destroy their entire lives over something that happened when I was a kid. He said I needed to grow up and stop acting like the world owed me something just because I'd had a rough childhood. That made me angry. I reminded him that he'd stood in the doorway and watched Margaret pack my things into trash bags, that he'd called me a mistake that was ruining their real family, that he'd threatened to have me arrested if I came back. I told him he didn't get to lecture me about maturity or forgiveness after participating in throwing a 16-year-old out in the snow. Margaret tried to calm things down. She said they'd all made mistakes, that David had been trying to protect their marriage, that the situation had been more complicated than I understood. She brought up that she'd been overwhelmed during that time, dealing with divorce stress, trying to blend a family, managing David's adjustment to having a teenager in the house. She said David had never had kids and didn't know how to handle the situation. I asked her why that was my problem, why I should care that David couldn't handle being a stepfather, why I should feel sympathy for them being overwhelmed when their solution was to erase me completely. Margaret didn't have an answer for that. She just kept crying and saying this was all such a mess. Then David played a different card. He said they'd been supporting me indirectly by maintaining the house all these years, that the property had increased in value by at least $80,000 during their time there, and I was benefiting from their maintenance and the market appreciation. He said ethically, even if not legally, I owed them something for that value increase. I pointed out that maintaining a property you're living in rent-free isn't charity work, that they'd been getting free housing worth roughly $20,000 a year, which over 7 years was $140,000 in value they'd received. Even with their inflated renovation costs and made-up repair expenses, they'd come out way ahead. David started arguing math with me, but his numbers didn't make sense, and he knew it. That's when Margaret's phone rang. She looked at it and went white. It was David's mother. She didn't answer, let it go to voicemail. David checked his phone and had 3 missed calls from his dad. We all just sat there for a moment. Then Margaret's phone rang again. Same number. She answered this time, put it on speaker without thinking. David's mother was asking about a notice that had been delivered to their house. Something about the property on Maple Street. Something legal. Margaret's eyes went huge and she looked at me. I hadn't sent anything to David's parents. I told her that, but then it clicked. The eviction notice had been filed with the county clerk as a matter of public record. David's parents must have been checking something, maybe refinancing their own property or doing estate planning, and somehow came across the filing that listed Margaret and David as tenants, not owners. David grabbed the phone and took it off speaker, walked outside to talk to his mother. Margaret sat there shaking. She said this was exactly what she'd been afraid of. Everything was falling apart. I didn't say anything. I just watched her spiral. David came back inside 10 minutes later. His face was red and he sat down heavily. He told Margaret they needed to go, that they had to drive to his parents' house right now and explain everything. Margaret asked what his mother had said. David just shook his head and told her they needed to leave. Before they left, Margaret turned to me one more time. She said if I went through with the eviction, I'd be destroying more than just their housing situation. I'd be destroying their relationship with David's family, their reputation in their social circle, their financial stability for years to come. She said all of this could be avoided if I just showed some compassion and worked with them. I told her she had 51 days left to figure out her next move. She walked out. Robert asked me tonight if I felt guilty about any of this. I told him no. He said good, that Margaret made her choices and I was making mine. But he also said David's parents getting involved was going to make things more complicated, that I should be prepared for them to potentially reach out to me directly. I'm not worried about David's parents. I'm not worried about Margaret's reputation. I spent 7 years being nobody to her, and now she wants me to care about her problems. The 60-day notice stands. And honestly, after watching her try to manipulate me with fake property damage and then learning they scammed David's parents out of $50,000, I'm even more sure this is the right thing. 44 days until they're out. Final update. Robert was right about David's parents. They reached out to me, not through Margaret or David, but directly. David's father found my number through the legal documents filed with the eviction notice and texted me last Friday asking if we could talk. I agreed to meet him for lunch on Saturday. Just him, no David, no Margaret. His name is Andrew, and he's a straightforward guy who runs his own contracting business. We met at a diner and he got right to the point. He said Margaret and David had been lying to him and his wife for years about owning the house, and they'd given them $50,000 under completely false pretenses. He wanted to know the full story from my perspective before he decided what to do about the money. I told him everything. The trash bags getting kicked out at 16, the trust fund, the 7 years of silence, all of it. Andrew listened without interrupting, and when I finished, he sat back and said he'd suspected something was off about their housing situation. But David had always been vague about the details. He said his wife, Linda, had questioned why they never seemed to have mortgage paperwork or property tax documents to handle. But David always had excuses. Andrew told me he was demanding the $50,000 back immediately, and if they couldn't pay it, he'd be taking legal action against his own son. He said he didn't care if it destroyed their relationship because David had already destroyed his trust. Then he asked me what my plans were for the house after they moved out. I told him I was moving in, that I'd been living in Robert's spare room for 7 years, saving money specifically so I could afford to maintain the house once I got it back. Andrew nodded and said that made sense, that it was my property and I had every right to reclaim it. Then he said something that surprised me. He told me if I ever needed any work done on the house to call him, and he'd give me a fair price. He said he respected what I was doing, that David needed to face real consequences for once in his life. We shook hands and left. I texted Robert about it, and he said Andrew sounded like the kind of person who actually holds people accountable, unlike Margaret. The following week was intense. Margaret started texting me multiple times a day from different numbers because I kept blocking her. She was trying every angle she could think of. First, it was guilt about family bonds and how I was destroying our relationship permanently. Then it was anger, saying I was cruel and heartless and exactly like Robert, which she clearly meant as an insult, but honestly just made me more certain I was doing the right thing. Then she tried bargaining again, offering to sign over her parental rights formally if that would make me feel better. as if I needed her permission to exist without her in my life. David sent longer messages trying to logic his way into an extension. He argued that 60 days wasn't enough time to find adequate housing in their price range, that the rental market was competitive, that they needed at least 90 days to make proper arrangements. He sent me listings for apartments they were looking at, all of them smaller and in worse areas than where they'd been living. He kept emphasizing how much they were sacrificing, how much they were losing, like I was supposed to feel sorry for them. I didn't respond to any of it. My lawyer had already told me that any communication with them should go through him at this point, so I forwarded everything to his office and let him handle it. He sent them a formal letter reiterating that the 60-day notice was legally sufficient and wouldn't be extended under any circumstances. 2 weeks before the deadline, Margaret showed up at my work. I have no idea how she found out where I work, but she was waiting in the parking lot when I got off my shift. She tried to approach me and I walked right past her to my car. She followed me, talking the whole time about how she'd made a huge mistake 7 years ago, how she'd been a different person then, how she wanted a chance to rebuild our relationship if I'd just give her some time and grace. I unlocked my car and got in. She put her hand on the door to stop me from closing it and said they had nowhere to go, that they'd applied for apartments but kept getting rejected because of their credit scores and debt-to-income ratio. She said they might end up in a motel or worse. And did I really want that on my conscience? Did I really want to be responsible for making my own mother homeless? I told her she had 13 days to figure it out and pulled the door closed. She stepped back and I drove away. I watched her in my rearview mirror, standing in the parking lot. Robert asked me that night if Margaret showing up at my work bothered me. I told him no, that it was just more proof she'd do anything except actually take responsibility for her choices. He said Margaret had always been like that, even during their marriage, always finding ways to make her problem someone else's fault. The week before move-out day, David's parents officially demanded repayment of the $50,000. Margaret called me from yet another new number, crying so hard I could barely understand her. She said David's parents were threatening to sue them, that they couldn't pay back that kind of money, that they were going to lose everything. She begged me to talk to Andrew, to convince him to give them more time or accept a payment plan. I asked her why she thought I'd do that. She said because she was my mother. Because family helps each other. Because I had the power to make this easier for everyone. I told her she'd given up any claim to the family argument 7 years ago when she packed my things in trash bags. She hung up. 3 days before the deadline, I drove past the house. There was a moving truck in the driveway, and I could see Margaret and David loading boxes. They looked exhausted. I didn't stop. I just wanted to confirm they were actually preparing to leave. Move-out day was a Thursday. I showed up at 10 in the morning with Robert, my lawyer, and a locksmith. The moving truck was gone, but David's car was still in the driveway. I knocked on the door. David answered. He looked terrible. Hadn't shaved in days, wearing old clothes. He said they needed a few more hours to finish clearing out. I told him the deadline was today, that they needed to be gone by end of business. He started arguing that technically end of business meant 5 p.m., so they had 7 more hours. My lawyer stepped forward and said if they weren't out by noon, we'd begin the formal eviction process with law enforcement assistance. Margaret came to the door then. She looked at me and said they'd taken everything that belonged to them, that the house was empty except for a few cleaning supplies they were about to grab. Then she asked if I was happy now, if this was what I'd wanted all along, to see them broken and desperate. I told her I'd wanted my house back. That's all this had ever been about. She shook her head and said I'd get the house, but I'd lost any chance at having a real relationship with her, that she'd tried to make amends and I'd thrown it back in her face. David added that I'd be living in that house alone, knowing I'd destroyed 2 people's lives to get it, and he hoped it was worth it. Robert spoke up then. He told them they'd destroyed their own lives by lying to everyone around them and living beyond their means. He said I'd been living in his spare room for 7 years while they enjoyed free housing in a property that was never theirs. And if anyone should feel guilty, it was them. Margaret tried to argue with him, but Robert just turned and walked back to his truck. They left by 11:30, loaded the last few items in David's car and drove away. Margaret didn't look back. David did just once, and then they were gone. The locksmith changed all the locks. My lawyer handed me the new keys. I walked through every room of the house. It was cleaner than I expected. They'd left it in decent shape, probably hoping it would earn them some goodwill that might translate into me backing off on other consequences. It didn't matter. The house was mine. I'm writing this from my bedroom in my house. I moved my things in over the weekend. Robert helped me set up furniture. It's strange being here, walking through rooms where I lived as a kid, where I was kicked out of as a teenager, and now where I live as an adult who owns the whole thing. Margaret tried texting me one more time yesterday. She said David's parents are moving forward with the lawsuit, that their lawyer says they'll probably win a judgment for the full $50,000 plus legal fees, that it's going to financially ruin them for years. She said if I'd just shown some compassion, none of this would have happened. She said I was vindictive and cruel and she didn't recognize me anymore. I blocked that number too. Some of you will probably think I went too far. That family should forgive each other. That holding on to anger from 7 years ago is unhealthy. I don't care. Margaret chose David over her own child. She threw me out in the snow with trash bags and $60 and told me I was ruining her new life. She changed her number, moved without telling me where, threatened me with police if I tried to come back. She spent 7 years pretending I didn't exist while living rent-free in property my grandparents left to me. Now she's dealing with the consequences of every choice she made. She's living in a cramped apartment, fighting a lawsuit from her in-laws, facing social embarrassment from everyone who thought they owned a house, and probably dealing with serious marriage problems because David's whole identity was built on being successful and stable, and now he's neither. And me? I'm living in my house, the one my grandparents wanted me to have, the one I waited 7 years to reclaim. I don't feel guilty. I feel vindicated. Robert came over last night to help me set up my internet. We ordered pizza and ate in the living room. He said my grandparents would be proud of me for standing my ground. I said I hoped so. He told me they definitely would be. This morning I saw Margaret's car drive slowly past the house. She didn't stop, just drove by, then turned around at the end of the street and drove past again. I watched from the window. She did it 3 times before finally leaving. She can drive past all she wants. This is my house now. It always was. This has been a Trust Test Hub original story. Sometimes justice isn't about revenge. It's about reclaiming what was always rightfully yours. Thanks for listening.